ado, I call this House into order and call upon the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Dear panel, we believe that the most crucial policy area in the world today is the historical and current discrimination and oppression of women, of 50% of the population throughout the entirety of human history existing until today. We're talking about violence, we're talking about enslavement through social institutions, we're talking about work, 50% of the work in the world that goes unrewarded because it is done within the family cell. We're talking about things that make women lesser and deprive them of the most fundamental rights. We believe our mechanism is the only way to change that. In terms of mechanism, two things. One, we see this as a global motion, this happens everywhere. Secondly, I think it's quite straightforward. We mean every head of party, those making decisions, those setting priorities, setting what the agendas of parties are going to be, will be women. We say that men can obviously occupy other positions within parties, just not the leadership positions themselves. Three things I'm going to bring to you. First, why only women and only women can promote women's issues effectively. Secondly, why we have to enforce this and make this only them, they will be able. Thirdly, about representation, why we believe we get more of it on our side of the house.
Clarification.
Yes.
Is this indefinite? Will you always have women?
Possibly, if we reach total equality, we will change this, but until then, yes. Okay, let's, and this will be for future parliament to decide at which point this equality has been achieved. Let's talk about why only women can advance this. First of all, we talk about prioritization. The fact that, that we have had, years and millennia of policy making have set certain areas to be the most influential, to be the most important, to be those you have to prioritize. Things like, for example, prioritizing geopolitical security. Things like economics and GDP growth being the most important functions that states and governments are seen to possess. We're saying that these are male-centric perceptions to begin with. Why is that the case? Because women are significantly less safe internally, within the household, within streets, within things that are not covered by discourse on what are seen as politically important positions and cabinet positions, things that are important to prioritize within a party. We're saying men are simply, in that sense, incapable of understanding why those priorities matter. However, we say there is an experiential issue, an experiential gap here, in which women are able to understand these things significantly better. They have experienced them themselves. They experience what it means to exist within their own bodies, something men can only guess at and can only make assumptions about. The fact that things like street lighting for men are an issue of public utility, for women are an issue of public safety, and a crucial one in terms of their ability to feel safe within their own environment. Things that don't occur to men, and that men would also feel uncomfortable even trying to discuss and promote. We're saying, why do we believe women will promote these things? First of all, because they have been experienced by them, because it's more likely that they are aware of them. Secondly, just because of this legislation that says you are there in order to promote these issues, that is why you were granted the role as head of party. That is something we believe is crucial in setting agendas. What sort of policies do we believe that we're going to see? We're going to see, finally, an actual treatment to sexual offenses, seen as what they are, as domestic abuse being treated the same as terrorism, in the sense of the investment it gets, and in the sense of the investment and the resources going into treating this. We're talking about child support rights. We're talking about the fact that, as I said, 50% of the work being done in the world is being done within internal households, which which goes unpaid for, and we believe these are massive policy changes that can only occur on our side of the house. Obviously, we don't believe it's perfect. We don't believe every woman is likely to be able to do these things perfectly. However, we say we get significantly more diversity of women, which I'm going to explain next. And men just don't have the ability of doing this in the first place. Therefore, we believe and besides that, on the principle level, we just believe they have the right for their voice and their preferences to finally be heard, and we believe we're getting that much better on our side. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Who do you think controls policy making within political
Okay? First of all, if you believe there are other factors that control policymaking, we are willing to have them being controlled by women as well. Secondly, obviously there is a huge influence by specifically the head of a party, the person who becomes the president, the person who becomes the prime minister, the person who leads, who sets the agenda of that party. Let's talk about why we have to why this has to be forced. Because first of all, even it's just impossible to implement this as a 50-50 policy. Like if we're talking about one person, it's not like making 50% of the seats in parliament of women. You can't split that person in half. Secondly, women, because of social perception, women are seen as less charismatic, less tough. Yes?
In parties in which it is all the members of that party who vote on the politics that party will take up, will you force them all to be women?
No. But we won't necessarily in every party achieve a perfect world. Our burden is to show a better one. Women, because of societal perceptions, are seen as less charismatic, less strong, having less of an ability to cope, and being less seen. When you're talking about being seen as presidential, obviously, if all presidents have been men, men will be seen as more presidential. This is a thing that means very few women are likely to get to these positions. Moreover, women are conditioned to give up their place for others, for men, for the party unity, for all these things. That again is something that means we get significantly less of these women in there. Finally, we say that the women we do get there are those women who have applied to themselves the exact standards of a male-dominated society. Women like Hillary Clinton who are super competitive or very aggressive and assertive in their style, which we say is great, but does not reflect many women and their preferences. We say our system is the only one in which you get women who are less assertive, women who represent different views of women, more diverse women, not just the rich white one. These are the women only our side can get representation quickly. Two elements that comprise representation. One, policy, the second, identity. In terms of policy, we think men are still given the right to vote, they're still given the right to influence agendas to a very large extent. We don't see a situation in which there won't be any capable women of carrying out those jobs, and the experiential gap that we've spoken about is a one-way street, right? Because we all know, because of the entirety of society, what men experience the world to be like, so we don't believe that women are not able to access that information in the same way. About the identity representation, yes, we believe there may be some men for whom it's very important to have a man representing them. However, we believe that is minute in terms of when we compare that to women being role models, to women seeing other women succeeding, progressing, because they have never seen such models, or they rarely see them, because men see successful men everywhere. They haven't seen them for hundreds of years, and they have enough of this identical representation. We just say that is less important. Very proud to propose the motion. Thank you very much.
Wow, this is a great debate. Not only have I found my notepad, but also I'm leader of opposition in a really stupid idea that throws away democracy trying to solve a single issue everywhere in the world, no matter what the situation is. Yay! Let's give 7 minutes on why this is a terrible idea. 2 notes on this. One, they define it as global debate. We're going to hold them to that. Second note that Ayal nonchalantly says, yes, any position of power, if there's anywhere else who can influence it, then we're also going to put them as women. That'll be important. We'll also hold them to that. Let's start with some rebuttal, and then I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. 1, right to democratic representation. 2, using false leaders. And 3, where was this? Backlash. Where's my backlash point? There it is. Let's start with some rebuttal. So 1, only women can do this. Wow, that's very interesting, because somehow over the last 2,000 years, we've managed to move from women literally being property to women having full equal legal rights and still earning only 7 cents on every dollar. We agree that's bad, but somehow we made all these changes. Apparently there were tons of women leaders all of this time because no one else could make any change. We agree that women might be slightly better placed to make that change. We're absolutely fine with that. We don't think that is necessary. 2, we need to force this. This is incredible given the time this motion is being set. Let's look, for example, at the United States, which is a leader kind of both globally and culturally, because a woman has just won the popular vote. Yes, she by a very small margin lost, but we've just moved from, like I said, women being property to women literally being on the tip of winning an election. They are going to throw that all away on this crazy idea of throwing democracy into the bin of history just so because they seemingly think that we need to force this on people. Note, even though I'm putting this in rebuttal, this is incredibly important for the framing and the comparative of this whole debate. What we're risking and throwing away is centuries of every 20 years having incredible progress that the time now would be unrecognizable only 20 years ago, and the same goes 20 years before that, and before that. That is what we're risking here when we're trying to use this extreme policy, no thank you. And lastly, we have this interesting point about representation. So when he says, look, the most important thing is policy, and it doesn't matter for policy if it's a man and woman. Really? Because all of your previous analysis said that this will force the most important issue to be women's rights, and it will necessarily change the way in which our government treats the way, commercial workers' rights, the way in which it treats voting rights, the way in which it treats sexual assault. So we genuinely believe that by Ayal's analysis, it is impossible that it doesn't matter for policy. And secondly, in representation, I'll talk a bit more in my right for democratic representation. So let's move on to my points. Right to democratic representation. Note, if this actually works, and that's a big if, we think it's a horrible crime against your people and your democracy. All people and all democracy in this debate. Why? Because people have the right to be elected, right? A person has the right to say, I want to influence. I have specific ideologies. I think I know how to make a change. That is impossible for half of your population. Secondly, you have the right to elect who you want. And I already talked about policy because I already mentioned it. Let's talk now about representation. Because he says, look, in representation, some people want a man. But it's important to note that the most important things we elect a president for is not only the specific ideology, but also trusting that specific person to be able to make the right decision. We spend billions of dollars of an election choosing between specifically two people. They are now on with one stroke going to take out 50% of the whole population. This is terrible. Why is this even more important than the problems that they are trying to solve? Because we know that before women's suffrage, when women had no right to vote, that was much worse than the relatively small remaining problems in society. When you're now taking away the ability of people to have either certain policies or elect certain people, we think that is an atrocity. 2, using false reserves. So this was all if they managed to make this work, but they obviously won't manage to make this work. Because even though Ayala is happy to throw away all of parliament and say they all have to be women just to have control over power, not all of parliament, only people in kind of very powerful positions, fine. But as long as they don't get their policies enacted, right, they are throwing away democracy as long as they don't get their policies enacted. The practicalities remain. So even though they're doing this kind of very extreme, they still don't get what they want. Why? Because when there are governments where people can't elect the people they actually want, what they do is they informally make sure that the people in power are the ones that they want. For example, in Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi is controlling the parliament, even though she can't be elected. What they have is just have candidates say, I am going to trust that person. I'm going to listen to what they say and have their policies. Secondly, if you took the example of Russia also, Putin couldn't run for a third direct run. Clearly, he just becomes a different position and someone says you listen to. You cannot control what people vote for because if the political will is there, as long as you have some democratic institutions, the political will is there, candidates can always serve what the people actually want. So, why is this bad? You could say then all of our harms also fall away. That is incorrect. 2 major harms by this being kind of this indirect political process. 1, it's a much less effective and controllable democracy. It's harder to change power, right? Because just because you elect someone else doesn't necessarily mean you will be electing someone effectively. Second, it's harder to criticize. There's this 2-level thing going on, right? Who are you criticizing? The original person? Maybe everything was the mistakes of the implementation of who you actually elected president. 3, you can't make sure you have actually alternatives, right? Because if your 2 candidates that end up running happen to listen to the same person, right, and declare that, you have no effective democracy. So you're genuinely risking democracy by doing this even though you don't get the policies that want. Secondly, know that this harms women. Why? Because what we put in the spotlight is women that have given, and I quote Ayal, every chance to succeed, right? They've been giving all the power, and still they decide to choose to rely on men. And still they can't do it themselves. Again, they're only doing this to appease the public, which will want men. But we think that the way you actually affect how people perceive women gets worse. Lastly, let's talk about backlash. But first, yes.
Your principle literally asserts that people have the right to be elected and represented equally. Presumably that's up for grabs in this debate. Give us a reason why they ought to have.
Yes. So maybe this is a good opportunity to say, I also don't agree with Ayal that everything has to do with, that women's right is the only important thing we have democracy for. We think that also things like preventing nuclear war, giving people basic human rights, these are all things that are at least equally important to giving women the rights, which is also very important, and therefore we do think that the basic tenets of democracy still stand. Lastly, let's talk about backlash. Note, 1, they say it's going to happen everywhere. Do you realize that in most places, we're not just, almost electing women, but there are many countries in which women don't have rights. This is an abomination according to, let's say, their religion or their culture or so on. In these places, we think it's really very reasonable to say there will either be a military coup of this non-democracy but kind of weird, bizarre pseudo-democracy or a religious revolt. Even in places like democracies, Trump supporters show that when people feel they're not listened to, when their political goals can't be met, they will fuck up the system. And I mean, Trump is a beautiful example of that. Let them choose only between women. They can really screw you up when you're frustrated. We think this will lead into an incredible revolt, both in democratic and in previously, I guess, undemocratic countries, which will obviously completely collapse, not getting any of these goals. Please don't throw away basic tenets of democracy for a very ineffective system. We beg you to oppose.
Macau, in which we stand, has the highest domestic abuse per capita rate in the world because of its gambling industry. In China, more broadly, 25% of women will in the course of their life be subject to some form of spousal or sexual abuse. And if England lose tonight, as they probably will, domestic abuse rates in England will rocket. And yet, Sella tells us that the problem of women facing is small because, hey, Hillary Clinton almost won an election. We think, in fact, the problem the vast majority of women face isn't something like microaggressions or body image. It is the problem of survival, the problem of fear of male violence. That is equivalent to the threat of nuclear war, and unless side opposition can show us that nuclear war is going to result from this policy, which they didn't, we believe that 50% of people living out much of their lives at fear of male violence is the most important issue in this debate. So 2 points in this speech. Firstly, principally why we think women are entitled to this representation, not just why it's legitimate. Secondly, why we think we are less likely to get the politics of dictatorship and the politics of violence on our side of the house. Before that, responses to Sella. So firstly, they say that we don't prove that only women can do this. So we agree we don't prove that. Well, what we think has been proven by history is men cannot accomplish a satisfactory change in this regard. The BJP in India, literally the largest country in the world, having overtaken China, could genuinely be characterized as caring more about the rights of cows than the rights of women. So yes, there might be progress for privileged women in the US, but for the world's fastest growing country, no can do, no progress. We know men can't do it. We think it is unlikely women will do worse. And given this is an analogy to continuing genocide, we think there are structural reasons thinking it'll be significantly better, and given it affects so many people, will buy some principled harms on that side of the house. Secondly, in terms of democracy, firstly, they say you have a right to be elected. No, thank you. We think that there is a right to be elected, but all rights are ultimately a trade-off, and a way up against other rights. We can tell the right to be elected is not an important one to the vast majority of people because they never consider exercising it. By contrast, the right to be safe from violence, the right to have access to good childcare, etc., are rights which the vast majority of people would consider exceptionally important and choose to try and exercise every day. So if there is any degree of trade-off, we should always choose the right, reject the right to be elected. Go for it.
Would you only allow women to run for office if they affirmatively say that they're going to pursue policies against male violence that you support?
No. We think there is a significantly greater chance that women will pursue policies against male violence, and there will be a great improvement. Look, are we claiming that every woman will implement feminist policy? No. Do we think there is a significantly greater chance they will do so? Yes. And given we are talking about 3.5 billion people, we think the overall impact of that marginal change is just sufficiently enormous to win us the debate. In terms of people's right, no thank you, to vote for specific people who you trust. Look, ultimately, if you live in a country, being asked to choose from half of the population is not a significant restriction to be placed on you, unless you live on Andorra, in which case the restrictions you place on how many people you can choose from are so big anyway, it doesn't really make any difference. But specifically, because there will be well-qualified people drawn from women in even the world's most regressive countries, and even if there aren't, those people will be created very rapidly by the demands of this policy, and therefore you will be able to have someone you trust. Note, we already face all sorts of restrictions on who we can vote for. I don't get to vote for the person I like. I have to vote for the person on the ballot paper, the person who is in my district. Why is this an important restriction which we should trade off against the rights of half the population? Thirdly, in terms of decision-making as raised by closing in their POI. So, look, Do political party leaders control decision-making in all scenarios? No. Do they have significant influence? Definitely. They control the chairing of discussions which are taking place. They set the agenda, they can make rousing speeches to the membership, and therefore in membership-based organizations, no thank you, determine which ways those memberships are going to go. They have significant influence to create change. But secondly in this, in terms of the idea, no thanks, that there will be some degree of kind of filleting the constitution so it can be run from behind the scenes. If they're concerned about things being run from behind the scenes, that happens anyway. No real change on either side of the house. But we think in most countries this isn't what will happen. Why? Because becoming president gives you a certain degree of prestige, a certain degree of respect, which means that actually if someone else is trying to run the country from a dark room, you can probably defeat them in a political tussle. But also, that would require filleting your country's constitution such that you take away all the powers from your elected leaders. Unlikely, again, to be something many countries are going to do. So, on margin, are some of these people going to be token figureheads? Sure. Are the vast majority of them going to be? No, definitely not. They will exercise a high degree of power and influence. Finally, in terms of this idea about a military coup or religious revolt. So, at its worst, this point could be characterized as why the motion wouldn't happen and therefore illegitimate. But let's take it at its best. We would note that even conservative countries have had female leaders. For example, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan. We think that women could therefore occupy positions in conservative countries without sparking a military revolt or a coup. It is ridiculous of side opposition to claim there will be coups in response to this. But hey, actually, if there are countries in the world which are so sexist that they will have a coup because a woman is put in charge, that makes it even more ridiculous for sellers to claim that the oppression of women is a dying problem, which we can afford to just say is unimportant and prioritize other things. Firstly, in terms of the politics of reparations, look, we think governments are structurally responsible for creating the wealth of their country and the privilege of men off the backs of women. For example, the government in Nigeria which denies people access to contraception and abortion such that the average woman in Nigeria gives birth to 8 children. Imagine what that does to your life, your ability to choose things for yourself. We think you are owed reparations in the form of the ability to be better represented in your government. And if that trades off against the right of men in some scenarios, fine, we'll buy that. Secondly, the politics of violence. We note the global structural trend is for a politics of machismo, a politics of violence, a politics of dictatorship, embodied by Trump, Erdogan, Duterte, Putin. We think this is structurally violent, not because we are making structurally male, not because we are making a biologically determinist claim, although there are plausible arguments in that regard, but more because we think this variety of leadership is specifically associated with men. If men adopt a consensual style of leadership, for example, Ed Miliband or David Cameron or Emmanuel Macron, they are portrayed as unmasculine, lacking in strength, not a good representative of their gender. By contrast, they adopt an ideology of violence like Trump or Modi, they are seen as a representative of their gender, a real man. By contrast, if women adopt that ideology of violence, they'd be seen as a Lady Macbeth figure, as unnatural as a traitor to their gender, resulting in harm to their electoral image. Men are therefore incentivized to adopt the politics of violence and dictatorship. Women are incentivized not to. We gave you the most important case in the world, very proud to propose.
Sorry, I'm just trying to put my phone up so I can see it. Whatever. I think it is unimaginably cruel to tell young girls they can be whatever they want to be, without recognizing that they are born into a system that systematically and structurally shuts them out from wielding any kinds of political power whatsoever. Opening opposition tries to claim to you that democracy is important and you have a right to be elected. From closing government, we will tell you that democracy is only important insofar as it is a system that reduces the concentration of political power and seeks to give the voices back to the voiceless. One huge extension for you today about the principles of reparations and how this changes policies and politics for the better, prevents the ossifying of political culture, and allows women to be better represented. Before that, 3 quick points of responses that I think also frame my extension for today. First of all, indirect control and tokenism. Panel, recognize the comparative. Tokenism happens anyway. The comparative is that you have token women that are just in a position where they can't do anything and are even more easily dismissed than if they were heads of state. Then they said, this is about backlash. Oh my god, like LOL. Backlash literally happens anytime you try to do anything ever with putting women in positions of power. I'm just going to say it probably normalizes in the long run because men probably can't do anything at the point where your woman's your president or it's not anything too bad, and in the long run it's really just going to even out. Then they said, you have to work through parliament and Congress. Again, I'm going to show you in my extension why in the long run you get more women flooding into politics. This probably changes the dynamics of how Parliament and Congress works. Yes, we agree we're not going to pass all the policies at once. You're not suddenly going to get miraculous free abortions, free contraception in Alabama, but you're going to get something that is a damn sight better than what we have now. The second issue they give us is, but why women? Why not the indigenous community? This is bizarre. First of all, women are a cross-cutting category. They are likely to encompass other identities. See Alexandria Cortez, who just won New York State. She's both a Latina and a woman. The second reason is because they're just the largest group of discriminated minorities that we have right now. Oh my god, they are literally 50% of the population. Bizarre statement coming from Paul. Then the third thing they say is, but what are women going to do when they're in the office? They already have like the vote and everything. Okay, opening government said, statistically, they're more likely to pass female-friendly policies. From closing government, I'm going to say, you get lots of different kind of women. We need to break the societal view that women can only be feminine and nurturing, or can only be like Thatcherite and Clinton and conservative, right? We need a diversity of different women who are in highly visible political positions, because it's only in that way that you can break the mold. There can only be one kind of woman politician, because that's the entire assumption that opposition is working on. I think if you can have a Supreme Court that's like 9 men, you can have a Supreme Court that's 9 women, it will like do many good things for representation. Extension. And I think this also deals with a lot of what Paul calls social positions and like what kind of things women would do want to get to power. Look, I think we all basically accept that women are starting from a place of historical deprivation. Opening government says, this is because men have systemically privileged themselves in making policy decisions by prioritizing nuclear war and climate change. Paul says, but climate change really affects a lot of indigenous people. Look, first of all, climate change actually disproportionately affects women, so like, woo, go that. But second of all, I think the historical deprivation we're thinking about is actually about your basic participation as a political citizen. If you look at how women have been historically deprived of their rights, it's because they have been deprived of their political agency, right? They start on a back foot, they lost out on things like political networks, which required being inducted into old boys clubs. They lost out on things like the fact that macho posturing before they were able to enter the political arena became the main form of political communication that you're able to get, and they lost out of the fact that society now believes female representation is unnecessary. Listen to the rhetoric that opening opposition is giving you. They are saying empathetic men can do just as well as women. We already have some women in positions of power. In surveys of how people perceive women in society, men actually find women to talk as much as they do, even though they only spoke about 10% of the time. They find that to be an equal number of men and women in politics, even though women only make up 20% of political positions overall. All of these things are down to the fact that women have historically been shut out of political positions. That's really important. I'll come back to it later. The second thing women have been shut out of when they're shut out of politics is role models, which sounds really trivial, but basically you have no one to fashion yourself after in a way that society will recognize as a political figure. Two scenarios emerge here. The first scenario is the self-selection of women, which further reduces their political agency because lots of women are cut out from political representation at the start. If opening opposition is concerned about your right to be represented, then I will tell you that there's nothing crueler than a system that tells you you must choose between your identity as a feminine woman and your political aspirations. There's nothing crueler than something that says you can be a politician, you can realize your dreams, but only if you shed everything that makes you recognizably you when you look at yourself in the mirror. I think that's ridiculous. I think we change that at least. I think there's a greater impact than some men no longer being heads of state, right? You ensure that at least some women who have historically been disenfranchised are now able to do this. The second scenario is that the women who do self-select into this now have to model themselves after their male counterparts. This is terrible because of the double jeopardy that faces these kind of women, because they are neither a feminine woman nor a man playing a man's game in a masculine world. What is the impact of this? First of all, it ossifies political culture. It says to you that politics is a man's game, will always be a man's game. If you want to make it in the political world, you damn well better behave like a man, be aggressive, be macho, never give in. Why is this bad? First of all, principally, it restricts choices for women. Again, like I say, you choose between traditional femininity and your political aspirations. It's a bad choice. On a principle level also, and this goes beyond Rafi's like 30-second analysis of the principle of reparations, the principle of reparations basically attempts to target and ameliorate harm on the basis on which the harm was committed. Therefore, since we have taken political agency away from women, we give political agency back to women, and this is the most direct form of reparations we can possibly get. On a practical level, you reduce the kinds of political polarization that we see in today's world. Closing.
Those seems to be extracting their benefits and importance from countries that would never elect a woman, but their plausibility for countries that would. Can you name a single country this would work in, but is not making incredible progress for women every single decade?
Okay, first of all, I think this is a bizarre claim, because my claim is not that countries never elect women. My claim is that women at every single level in politics are shut out, that they self-select in a way that is incredibly detrimental, and that even when they are elected, they tend to be pushed towards the front of their party at times when the party is in crisis, so everything can be blamed on them. What we are doing is ensuring that every single party, regardless of what kinds of situations they're in, or whether or not they're going to succeed or fail, have a woman at the start. I don't understand what this POI is trying to get at. Practical level, look, on our side, we get far more options for the kinds of women that are in office. On a representational level, on a purely principle level, that is in an office have a good, because especially because the visibility of your position means the next generation is far more likely to then enter politics because you now have a role model to fashion yourself after. Second of all, I think it breaks down the kinds of old boys networks you have that previously composed the bulk of political maneuvering. I think what you get is a situation where eventually you get networks of women also helping and supporting each other, thus getting rid of Paul's problem with Parliament and Congress. The third thing I think you do is because a lot of women who were previously not have entered politics have been socialized to be communicative, friendly, and approachable, now enter politics because they see their personality is not antithetical to what politics is. This means you get a lot more reaching across party lines, a lot more pushing across the policies that you would not otherwise have gotten. I am incredibly proud, I've never been prouder to propose.
Panel will prove to you two things in our case. First, you actively make the lives of women worse in society, particularly, most importantly, in the developing world. So we're going to reframe the debate away to exclusive to them. But secondly, you also destroy you erode democratic systems and trust in democratic systems to the point where meaningful change in all other areas of policy becomes minimal, if not outright impossible. But the way this debate is to judge, yes, you will get almost certainly some benefits, role model or otherwise, on Gov. We can't escape from that. But the way this debate is to be judged is whether on op, as closing opposition, we can sufficiently mitigate all of Gov's benefits to say you get minimal change to then be compared with the active harms that we're going to bring to you. So let's start with the premise that we get from opening government, that women are going to pursue change for women. They're going to pursue policies that help women. They provide two reasons. The first, they say, is that there's their own experience, which CG then latches onto. I think it's their most important reason, that you advocate for policies that affect you because of your own experience. The problem here, firstly, not all women are liberal. As a fact, right, more women are anti-abortion in the US than are otherwise. But it's not just that conservative women exist as a fact. Why is it likely that the women who gets into power are likely the ones who don't side with you, but side with the people you don't like to begin with? And because here's the crucial distinction here. Opening opposition point out correctly that policy will be controlled by men. We're going to go one step further and say these leaders will be controlled by men. Why? How do you get elected as a leader of a political party, right? You need the rest of the political party to vote for you. Those votes are going to come from men. The way you get that is you need to then cater to these majority men factions in your political party to get elected. The more radical your proposals are, the more you move away from the issues these men perceive to be important, as OG says, economy and foreign policy, right? The less likely you are to get elected. If your manifesto isn't uber strong on economy and foreign policy, because IR says men care about these issues, you're not going to be the one who's put into power. So that means the women who get into power make the trade-offs between female issues and foreign policy and economy before they even get into a position of power, because you need to cater to them. The second thing is, privileged women often tend to get to the top, right? Not minorities or trans women or minority women who tend to be the most oppressed. Right? So the minimal experience of oppression. Sure, their response is comparative benefit. No, because you only help white privileged women for whom you could have gotten backing anyways. The issues that you want to really cater to are the ones that these women never have any experience to begin with. The second reason they gave for why women will pursue this policy is because you are granted this role to begin with. But that is contingent on men respecting you. I'm going to get into that now. Right, the first harm that you get by government policy, puppet leaders. Change in developing world matters more. Hopefully that's intuitive enough. Why then, therefore, do you get puppet leaders? First, because often the women who get access to power in these countries are daughters and wives of existing politicians. Sure, you pass this policy, and by tomorrow you need a female leader, but you don't change the attitudes around women and sexism tomorrow. That takes 50 years. So you're going to have to elect the wife or the husband or the daughter of the most important political man in your party. But second, we get puppet leaders because of all the sexist reasons that all the sexist system that exists because of OG and CG told you about, right? What that means is women will be trained to take on the leadership mantle, no thank you, in your party by sort of like the top male leadership within a political party. They're going to train them in a way, facilitate, gear them in a way that they know caters to their male constituency in these countries, right? No thank you. Opening government says, aha, but you chair discussions and control you control the party and boardroom discussions. Anyways, not anymore. Obviously, factions exist in any given political party in any country, developed or developing. The thing is, when a leader of a political party has a popular backing of individuals, he can control those factions because factions know they need to submit to him in the end because he's the one who gets the votes out ultimately. What happens in the developing world is often you end up voting for the big strong man in your regional rural area who can get you food, who can give you the kind of patronage favors that you require, who can help you out when you're in a tough position, right? Those are all exclusively local landowners or businessmen, the ones who have power and can get the vote out, are all exclusively men in all developing countries. That means they hold the leverage to get the votes out, which means women leaders now need to cater to them rather than vice versa. Also, just intuitively, all the principal reasons for why people will hate this policy, but also because it'll tick off some people, means women leaders are going to be less popular than simply because of the perception that they don't deserve it, which means they're on the back foot and are like on the lower end of the bargaining platform. That means you get less policy ability for them to push for policy. Why is it a problem that you get puppet leaders then? Here's where we move beyond opening opposition to say it's not just about coups and not about mitigation, but the active harms. No woman across the board is taken seriously anymore. Not just the women who's a leader, but any successive woman who comes up is going to be seen as deliberately privileged and given positions of power, deliberately trained to one day take over the current woman in power, because it's not like any man can take over to begin with. It colors your perception of all female leaders. You respect Hillary Clinton right now, sure, because she ran a good campaign. You celebrate Benazir Bhutto because she managed a tough life in a political world of men. But you don't when you think she only got there because a rightful deserving man could not. That colors your perception of all female issues. But two, and more, which means you never see them as respectful. You never buy into the policies that they want to, right? You never get the popular backing. But two, and more importantly, you need to, I'll take it in a minute, you need to convince men to help women in developing worlds. A lot of their analysis about getting backing applies to the developed world, but not when not when the vast majority of your population only looks towards men as authority figures who can tell them what correct social change is. Opening? No, closing.
Sure. So lots of debate societies, including Sydney, have affirmative action quotas for women that ensure that minorities are represented. Do you find them to be token of...
No, that's all fine, right? That's the point. No, we don't find them token. If you do that in Pakistan, yes, you find them visibly token because their people don't think women deserve that kind of thing. People react far more strongly to their rightful positions of power being taken away from them. Because men often don't have the ability, the religious pull, right? Or the economic pull to be able to say, look, this policy is good, we support it. Now, it's not going to be seen like that at all because it's just the woman pushing. But thirdly, and it's like this is the backlash point, right? People are unhappy with this because it's a distrust of political system. The individual you wanted to vote for isn't in party. Sure, not everyone cares about the right to vote and right to vote for whoever you want, but when you take it away from them, they instinctively respond angrily saying, no, I have a right to do that. Why are you taking this right away from me? That means you end up voting less across the board. If your party does badly, it's because of this policy, not because they're bad. So you're like, why bother anymore? Easy reason to hate other parties because they're not led by the ones most deserving, which means fewer people vote in the long term. That means you get minimal change for women, if any, but on our side, meaningful change across the policy platform becomes minimal because so many people are put off the democratic system because it's no longer democratic. Proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and call upon the Gov Whip to close out the government bench for this debate. You're here.
We are not saying that women cannot be elected in status quo. We are saying when women are elected in status quo, they are forced into a political arena in direct competition to men. They are compelled to masculinize themselves to compete with that standard that is currently prevalent in political culture. And this specifically diminishes the ability to change the world for the better. I've got 2 points of contention. Firstly, I want to talk about improving the lives of women. Secondly, I'm going to deal with the Sierra extension about the developing world. So first, let's talk about the lives of women. The opening government claim is that women are more likely to pursue policy that's good for women. Opening opposition's claim is both that, well, men could do this too, also women could get elected in status quo. The question the claim here is that there is sufficient progress in status quo that it does not legitimize overturning democratic rights. Okay, so in order to weigh up this clash, you need to consider two factors. Firstly, how much difference this policy makes compared to status quo in which women are elected, and secondly, what the threshold is on which we are allowed to restrict democratic rights. And these are two specific questions that Ernting answers in her extension. Let's talk firstly about the difference against status quo. Opening opposition says women make it to the top anyway, but they tend to become masculinized, right? They use the example of Margaret Thatcher. Okay, the question they don't ask is, why is it that when women make it to positions of power, they still nonetheless adopt classically masculine traits in the way they pursue policy making? The reason is because they are currently in direct competition against men, and given the perception in politics and in society more broadly that feminine traits are a disadvantage, you are forced comparatively to adopt masculine traits in order to succeed politically. I want to be very clear about the comparative, right? It is true that in our world, there will still be this general perception that masculine traits may be superior in some respects, but you're not in direct, visible competition against another man standing across the stage from you, adopting those same traits themselves. Also, Ernting points out how hugely stacked this competition is. It's about powerful networks like old boys clubs that are populated primarily by men, which is where political networks are formed, where personal relations are formed, where political advantage is gained in the background. It's also about how women are socialized into deference in the presence of men. So when there is a collection of men in a political arena within which you're a participant, either you adopt a classically, either the social pressure to be deferential diminishes your ability to aggressively pursue policy making, or you are forced to masculinize in order to prevent that sort of deference from occurring. The upshot of all this is very simple. We think opening opposition is right, that women can be elected currently, but that is not the solution to the problem we identify, because even when they are elected, they are unable to pursue policy making with that same leeway. Because, when there is a perception that you are pursuing uniquely, often you give a few nods to women's rights, but there is a general perception that if you hobby horse too much, for example, on women's issues, there is a perception that it's not sufficiently masculine. They are betraying feminine traits. And that's why it's important for us to break the entire system by not forcing you into direct competition with men in that reality. Okay, what's the democratic threshold on which we can restrict rights? No, thank you. The assertion from the opening opposition is that you have an equal right to representation and to run for office. We asked you, why do people have this democratic right? We think that democracy is a means to an end, and that specific end is the decentralization of power. That's the reason why we think people deserve to vote more broadly, because that allows power to be handed to individuals and away from centralization. We think that this breaks down the masculine centralization of power in precisely those old boys networks Ernting talks about, in the idea that social relations are formed that condition men to believe that they are the ones who are uniquely going to be figures of power and authority, and that lock women out when they are unable to access those same unique institutions. Ernting gives you a second reason why we can restrict democratic rights in this case, because of the right of restitution. Because another key function of representation is to ensure that past inequalities in representation are corrected for. And uniquely, we think that the type of inequality women have faced is a deprivation of political power. That's why not only is it important that we give women the right to be now, to be now the heads of political parties, but it's important they not do that in an arena where they're still competing against men and forced to assimilate classically male tropes, in order for them to succeed. They ask us, why this specific moral concern? I mean, this is a silly argument. This is tantamount to saying that we can't solve any one problem unless we can solve them all at the same time. We pick our problems, we pick the one that's particularly important in this case. What are the broader implications for the opening opposition case? So thank you. They give us an argument about indirect control that's largely repeated by closing opposition. Okay, we think indirect control is worse on that side of the house because in a world in which you have to cater to a male polity, it is much more likely that you lack leverage when you know that you can be replaced at any point by a man. This is unique because there is a unique responsibility that you carry with yourself, feeling like the alternative is a world in which there is one less female leader in a world where there are already too few. So that's why even if you could be replaced by another woman, that is not the same sort of pressure to conform to the demands of that polity. But secondly, there is going to be a huge numerical change in our side, right? Because there are lots of political parties around the world. That means you force a diversification of the sorts of women who are picked by those male polities on their side of the house. There is a gradual breaking down of that sort of indirect control into the long term. I'll deal with this more when I talk about the closing extension. Finally, the opening government talks about the politics of violence, and that's very important. But notice that the impacts of this only flow in a world in which we demasculinize femininity in politics. We've shown you how we achieve that, so all of those impacts rely on that claim. Let's talk about the closing opposition extension. I've already dealt with the logic about how indirect control is eroded on our side of the house. But I want to point out that the developing world context is literally the worst context for closing opposition in this debate, and here are 3 reasons why. Number 1, in that context, It is the most important thing that we normalize the view of women as individuals who could possibly wield political power. Assad is right when he says that we tend to look to men in those contexts as authority figures. It's a good thing then, and uniquely with with the leaders of political parties who are more visible to break down that particular normalized standard. Opening.
All of the structures and views and issues that you've outlined in your opening outline still exist when you change the person to top. You'd be the first person in your pitch to actually explain how women achieve any policy success, given that's what you predicated the case on.
The fallacy in that statement is that we are not only changing one person at the top, but we are changing the set of people against whom you are competing. And that breaks down the political pressures that apply for that competitive success. Second response, how do we erode male domination in this case? We think that it is a good thing in the long term for there to be fewer of those male political polities that you have to cater to. How do you begin the road towards sweeping change in terms of which women can enter politics? You need to begin somewhere, and our suggestion is that in a world in which there is high visibility given to specific female figures who are positioned who are in positions of authority, it's more likely you have young women in those specific oppressive contexts they describe who are willing to take up that mantle, because at least you know there is some guarantee of success. Some of you are going to make it. Some of you, in a world in which otherwise you would not, you have been the vast minority of politicians, are now sitting at the top. So you vastly encourage a groundswell in women who are willing to take up politics to begin with. That transforms the polities to which you are held to which you are held in thrall on that side of the house. Finally, this idea of backlash. When do people accept the reality that women can be powerful political leaders? It's when we normalize them, when we give them the optics of leadership as individuals who could possibly bear political power against us in a world in which we never believed that could otherwise be possible. The developing world is the worst context of closing opposition. We're winning in the other context anyway. Very proud to propose.
Three things in the speech. Firstly, on the principle. Secondly, on will the policy of political parties change as a result of this? And thirdly, on the political process and developing democracies and the future of democracy within these countries. Firstly, on the principle. Open opposition sort of kicked off by asserting the right to be elected. Opening government sort of hit back at that by saying that no, women were entitled to be within these positions. I think opening government and closing government do a huge amount of work pointing out that women's oppression is extremely bad, a fact which was never likely to be contested in this debate and was therefore probably at best wasted time. But I think ultimately what they don't prove is necessarily the best way to provide a voice to women. Because when they say 50% of women don't have a voice, that was obviously always going to be contingent on this debate, on them getting more of a voice in the last place. And so I realise this is often said, but it's definitely true in this round. The principle just ends up folding back into those other arguments. Closing government then said, oh, well, it's unfair because it's hard to access. They placed a lot of store in normalising this. You get more women in this process. But I would point out, the number of women competing is not the same as women being in those roles in a meaningful way. Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan might have only been one woman, but transformed the role of women across the country because she was seen as the most significant political leader that country has ever had. That is very different from a woman who you view as a figurehead and has been put there because they were the daughter of the person who used to be the leader of that party, but then this policy was put in overnight, and therefore you see her as vastly less legitimate. It's not just about the numbers. The second response here is they say, we are forced to masculinize. We gave you lots of reasons, and I'll get on to this later, why the process of who you pick for the leader will still be controlled by the men, because this policy is going to come in at some point. I reckon the people who control these parties will notice this policy is going to come in at some point and might change the structures of their parties. That's why it was bizarre when OG had this model confusion with the entire of the PM speech over who they were actually going to force. At some point, they will change the structure of these political parties so they can choose. You're still forced to masculinize because you're still forced to appeal to the men who ultimately controlled that selection process. Just because you're competing against other women for the appeal of men, that's not necessarily a good thing. That's also true of Miss America and competitions like that. It's not just that all the other, it doesn't necessarily make it a progressive thing that all the other competitors are female. Ultimately, this was again contingent on female change, on meaningful change for women, and so folds back into the rest of the debate. No, thank you. Second question, how will this policy actually affect, how will changing the political parties affect policy? Too many words that begin with P. Opening government said there's an experiential gap. We pointed out from closing that this wasn't necessarily true. More women are anti-abortion in the US than men, and the majority of white women voted for Trump. But the second thing to say here is that rich white women don't necessarily have the experience, as Assad pointed out, of other women, and that it's likely these are the women who are already going to get into power in the first place. They wanted to paint this dystopian picture of women never getting into power. It's true it's not great. It is getting better in these sort of countries. The countries in which it's not necessarily getting better, I will get onto in my final argument. Then, sort of on the whole, the PM provided a fairly unclear picture of how far or how radical this policy is. So ultimately, about the people who control policy will be women, but not MPs is if, as is the case in many parties, those MPs have to vote through the policy, so it clearly won't be women controlling policy in the first place. Look, parties can, as I previously pointed out, control the apparatchik systems by which people get put into certain places of power. Whoever you designate in your policy, the parties will realise this, and they will find the body which you haven't designated and give the power to that body. This is a system which they can't just say, oh, we'll do this perfectly, because there are structural reasons why you can't do this perfectly, or you just like mandate the entirety of all political parties or all women, which would clearly be just like a totally unreasonable policy that would make many of the harms that we pointed out worse. Ultimately, opening government said they had to prove they got significantly greater change, but it was just unclear. Opening opposition, I think, did prove why policy wasn't going to change, but it was only in closing that we pointed out why the selection of party leaders in the first place, and that's the crucial distinction on this point. Two responses from Rafi in his speech. What he said is, oh, you won't fill the constitution to take away power, and ultimately, if you're the woman in charge, you will demand control. That's only true if it's not easy to depose the leader, but in most party structures, it's easy to depose the leader. The president might have power through the government, but you can still remove that president and replace them, as happened with Beata Szydło in Poland. Right, finally, onto political process and developing democracies. Look, opening opposition banged a lot during Assad's speech, which is usually a sign they were a little bit worried there was quite a lot of new stuff there. Because opening opposition did say the words, figurehead, and there will be a coup. But it did come at the end of Salah's speech and was quite rushed. So I think if we provide lots more reasons for that and a much more plausible scenario as to how that ends up than a coup, that would be a significant extension on opening opposition, even if maybe 3 words were the same within the arguments. So, Assad... what did Assad tell you? He said, ultimately, you change the way that these elections are conducted when you do this. He gave the very plausible example of in developing democracies, given that often it is the relatives of political dynasties who control power. You'll just get the junior relatives of these men, and so they will still control change. He also pointed out the patronage power within these countries is still in the hands of men. They still control all of that. I'll take opening.
It's very easy to choose a woman who looks compliant, but once you've given her access to the airwaves, the prerogatives of political leadership, to all the powers of president, they tend to become a lot less compliant and will usually win the political fights which are involved in any attempt to remove them.
This is quite a Western motion. Deposing presidents is not actually that hard and happens in a vast majority of countries quite frequently where people are far more desensitized to it. And so it just seems to me that, like, if a party is worried that they are... Like, if it's a conservative party that has put a woman there and the woman stands up and does the thing that opening government is about and says free abortions, I suspect that conservative religious party might wear the problem without having to depose that in order not to pass something they view as sending them to hell. So I don't think it's likely they won't act in that scenario. Assad gave you 3 reasons here. He said that ultimately women wouldn't be taken seriously across the board. I think it's important to note this is where some of the too far analysis from the Gov bench that things can literally never get better just wasn't plausible. There are meaningful mechanisms by which these things are improving in these countries. And when you take a policy like this, you risk making those mechanisms not work. And that is a significant risk to take in this debate. However much you want to say it's just worse and will never get better, that clearly wasn't a plausible characterization. The second thing, and this is really important and totally new, you need to convince women to help men. And the sad fact of life is that that message is often delivered better by men who that community already trust. Closing government's case, for example, was weirdly contingent on, the most important thing in this debate was to help women who enter into politics. Ultimately, the most important thing is the policy change that results into the vast majority more of those women, and that was always contingent on the stuff that I've already rebutted in terms of them necessarily pursuing better policies for them. The third thing I think is really important, the distrust of the political systems in general goes down. That means in these countries where these political institutions are extremely fragile, that's when it tips the balance. That's what leads to the coup that opening opposition claimed but did not prove. 2 responses from closing on this. They said, oh, well, the most important thing is that you normalise, but we point out this wasn't normalising. What this was normalising a figurehead in that parties. So you were normalising something, but it wasn't free and fair open competition for these spots. The second thing is that young women will take up the mantle. I would love this to be true, but the young women who take up the mantle will realise their careers are dependent on getting selected for these things in the first place, and their political idealism will very quickly disappear under the mantle of necessity. Very proud to oppose.